But actually, we can really simplify this when it comes to youth sport. When we look at our kind of TDEE, our total daily energy expenditure, we know that 70% of our daily energy burn is going to be from our basal metabolic rate, so just existing. So that means that every single day, regardless of what we do, even if we sleep for the full 24 hours and we don't move, our basal metabolic rate will still require 70% of what we usually eat in a day typically. Then on top of that, we can start looking at some of the other numbers. So obviously we've got our NEAT activity, which is our kind of non-planned exercise, which is kind of walking, moving. I'm flailing my arms around talking now. I haven't planned on so many arm reps as I'm talking now, but ultimately that's going to be additional energy burn.
Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have on dietitian Dan Richardson. Dan works with a number of athletes, but most notably Leeds United Academy and Leicestershire County Cricket. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you very much for having me, Liam. Looking forward to getting stuck into lots of different pieces around nutrition, specifically around the youth athlete, and then probably pushing into some of the stuff around some of those more established athletes as well today.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting to have this conversation now, especially as the Olympics are going on and everything else, because I've watched a number of just athlete interviews already where they've already been talking about the importance of their dietitian or their nutrition and everything that goes into that. Because at the end of the day, it is one of the most important variables that go into youth athlete success as well as adult athlete success. But before we dive into any of that stuff, do you want to just give a quick background on yourself, your experiences, and what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always like to coin myself as the failed athlete that stuck around in sport long enough to become something that works within sport. So I was a rugby league player back in my day. I think I played professionally for about 3 games, and then I went off to university. I effectively had the choice of a semi-professional contract or to go off to university and kind of learn the trade as a sports scientist, nutritionist, etc. A quick conversation with my dad led him to let me know that I'm probably not good enough at rugby to be pursuing a full-time career in it. So go off to university and the door will always be open there if you are good enough. Turns out he was right. I didn't actually end up going back into rugby following that. I actually ended up working in rugby as one of my first roles out of university. So I graduated university with a sports science undergraduate degree from Durham University, and then went on to pursue a master's in sports nutrition to become a performance or sports nutritionist, however you want to coin the term. And from there, I then went on to work with a professional rugby team as their head of nutrition. So Warrington Wolves over in the UK, a rugby league side. I worked all the way from their first team to their academy pathway supporting athletes. That then led me to, I suppose, start my own little nutrition consultancy company called DRN Nutrition. And with that, ended up working with Leeds United Academy and also Leicestershire men's cricket. And amongst other contracts and athletes as well. So I've spent quite a lot of time. I think it's about 7 years now in professional sport, following graduating uni and loving it still, and still enjoying working with varying athletes all the way from kind of the under nines age groups where it's the fundamentals of nutrition up to kind of the under 21 specifically at Leeds that are trying to break into the first team. And like you said earlier, with the Olympics being around and everybody talking about nutrition and seeing all the little 1% margins as well in these races, and knowing how much nutrition can have a play in whether, your chest is over the line first, like last night in the 100-meter final, or like you look at some of the rowing where it's literally being a half a second, and swimming. Nutrition does play a big part in that. And I'm sure we'll tap into that today when we chat a little bit more about nutrition and performance.
For sure. How does, when you're talking to, say, some of your younger athletes or the adult athletes you work with, how does the nutrition conversation kind of differentiate itself? So what are some of the key points you're trying to hit with the younger athletes, and then what are some of the key points you're trying to hit with the older athletes?
Yeah, I think when it's youth athletes, it's so much centered around education. Like
Hmm.
the whole piece is really to educate the athlete so that they've got the tools that they need when they go into professional sport and beyond. And I think one of the key things I always like to think I do with the youth athletes is to give them the habits that will set them up for life, whether they stay in sport or not. Nutrition, arguably, performance nutrition and the high end stuff that some of the pros do isn't necessarily the healthiest. You look at some of the larger rugby players and the number of calories that they've got to consume to maintain performance is not necessarily considered healthy in the eyes of government guidance, etc.
Yeah.
Once you get to that point, then absolutely keep pushing with it, because that's how you're going to get those marginal gains to become better at your sport. But on the flip side, I think one of the key areas really is to focus on those healthy habits that those individuals can build, and also educate them as best as possible. When working with youth athletes, it's giving them the tools to then use them throughout the career. Whereas normally when I get into an athlete that's maybe in their adult career already, may have had a span of varying different nutritionists across different clubs, different teams, national, kind of national level, or maybe even county level kind of competition, may have had different nutritionists with different ideas. It's trying to bring them all together under one umbrella and allow them to continue to use what they've already learned,
Hmm.
but then add to their experience as well. So whether that be through a new form of supplementation that they may have never tried, or a new way of thinking when it comes to, for example, carbohydrate periodization, or ideas and models that they might not have looked to use. And sometimes, it is about dispelling their myths as well when they're an adult athlete. There's a lot of information out there online. Whether some of it's good and bad, I'll leave that kind of to the viewers to decide when they look at some of the stuff. But new topics and trends come up that stick with some of these adult athletes, and actually they become debunked quite quickly. So it's important as a nutritionist, I'm on top of the trends to make sure that they're getting the most out of their consultation process with me.
Yeah, and obviously, it's always great to hear what professional athletes are doing regards to their training, nutrition, all that sort of stuff. But being this podcast is more focused around young athletes, not becoming athletes. What are some of the things that you're finding they're most lacking when it comes to nutritional education? Is it, are they just not eating enough calories? Are they not having enough protein? Or like, what are sort of the things that you find yourself going over and over again with them?
Yeah, the big thing when it comes to youth sport is, a term coined as Red S, which is effectively relative energy deficiency in sport. Now,
Hmm.
years gone by, that was kind of always, I suppose, with the female athlete. And, we have the female athlete triad that's related to the menstrual cycle and more specific to the female body and how it works. But Reds is really prevalent, especially in academy sport and youth sport. So the big thing is trying to manage, first of all, the maturation rate of the athlete, because every single athlete will grow and
Hmm.
develop at different stages. I'm sure there's some young athletes watching this or maybe even some parents watching this that are waiting for that growth spurt, quote unquote, from their youth athlete, and it will come, but it comes at different phases. And yes, we can predict that to some extent using some of the data and of history of parents and looking towards maturation rates and growth, but
Hmm.
actually it will be different, person to person. So firstly, it's managing the expenditure of that. Normally, when you look at youth sport programs in academy football or any other academies, the demand for performance and training is much higher than those in the professional level. Games and fixtures tend to be more frequent. And in addition to that, there's often more national camps, trialist camps, and then training tends to be a little bit more intense, because, again, the coaches are trying to develop those athletes to become the best. They're not already there at the best, so they've got a lot of work to do. So
Hmm.
trying to build in kind of energy intake to the work to do can be quite difficult. So it's kind of multifaceted in terms of where all of this energy drain or expenditure comes from. And then we
Hmm.
also have to factor in that, if we're under 16 and we're not in a full time program at a club, we might be battling the challenges of being at school, not being able to consume enough food at school in between lessons, and also potentially the school not offering the most healthiest or athlete performance centric meals for sporting stars that are coming up. So there's a lot of different areas to manage. My biggest area I think I deal with and face with is underfueling. And a lot of the time it is around education. If I was to put some numbers out, today, and say, an average kind of youth athlete coming towards the end of their academy experience is looking at around 3,500 calories a day. whereas the suggested norm in the UK anyway for a male is 2,500 for an adult male. You can see there already the discrepancies between the
Yeah.
numbers if we were to follow kind of the government recommended guidelines versus what a performance athlete in youth sport that's trying to push on the doors of a first team is experiencing.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how much do or does the numbers differ when it comes to what we hear is average or normal for instance, like you just mentioned, caloric intake, but anything protein intake for athletes, all those carb intake. How much does it differ from what's considered normal or average to what actually is needed for these young athletes?
Yeah, so normally if we take protein intake for example as a lone macronutrient, one of the big things I think the government guidelines, and I may be corrected on this, it may have changed since I last checked, was around zero point 0.8 per gram per kilogram of body weight is required. So really simple maths: if you weigh 100 kg, you need to times that by zero point 0.8 to get your daily total amount of protein that's required.
Hmm.
Looking at some of the studies that are out there, even when we look at kind of the top end of academies, the 18s, 21s, you can typically see in rugby around 2.2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram required of protein, which is obviously a massive step up to what kind of is recommended for a healthy individual. But that's to support muscle growth, repair, recovery, and all that comes with it. So sport by sport will obviously vary, but typically speaking, we're around 1 gram per kilogram more than what the recommended guidelines are from the government side. And that's pretty much consistent across all macronutrients when it comes to carbohydrates and protein. Carbs, typically speaking, we want, over 6 grams per kilogram, ideally, of carbohydrates per day to perform better. Some of the more endurance based athletes will maybe look to carb load, which might send them up to that kind of 10 grams per kilogram per day. But the typical thing for me is always trying to translate this into usable information for youth athletes because, I've just spouted off, 3 or 4
Hmm.
different numbers there, which all sound great to anybody that understands their sports science. But it's trying to translate that to youth athletes as to what does 5 or 6 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates in an individual day look like visually on a plate, and how can we
Hmm.
build a plate that supports that kind of loading and fueling, and similar to protein for recovery and repair, how do we ensure that we get the 1.8 grams per kilogram for example across the day as well. So the importance really for me is the education side of that, and not really using the numbers directly with the youth athletes, but actually giving them visual representations to support them.
Do you have any kind of one-off quick practical recommendations for these? Like I know some people use like a fist or two fists or half a
Yeah.
plate or whatever it is. Do you have any quick guidelines for that?
Absolutely. So the one of the kind of methods that I try and use across a lot of the athletes that I work with is, again, using the number but then translating it into
Hmm.
kind of practice and focus. Is I go down the route of the 5G rule. So 5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates is pretty much your baseline of what you require as an athlete, whether you're recovering or training. And then it's adding the additionals to get it up to 6, 7, 8 grams per kilogram, depending on that day and the performance. So I like to use the rule of like the 5G is kind of your standard. 5G plus is then looking for that extra scoop of carbs on your plate. So that might be adding a bread roll, potentially scooping an extra portion of rice onto your plate. And then obviously 5G plus plus is then doubling up. So that might be a bread roll plus an additional scoop of carbohydrates. But again, visualizing that into a plate, typically speaking, 50% of your plate should be made up of carbohydrates if we're going for a high carb day in terms of fueling. And then every single snack should have some form of encompassing carbohydrates. So whether that be a banana, a cereal bar, a bagel, for example, and adding them into a bit more of a visual timeline can really help an athlete understand. And it's interesting you mentioned like the fists as well. I always think, we can often get confused with it sometimes as nutritionists of, is it a palm, is it a fist, is it a thumb? Everybody says, a thumb sized piece of fat. I like to use those as visuals when it comes to, for example, carbohydrates, because you can kind of see if you put a fist up, that would be around a quarter of a plate. And if you put two fists up, you're probably looking around half of a plate. So you can do that with that. But when it comes to fats, and we say a thumb sized piece of fat, fat can often be within our oils, in our spreads.
Yeah.
It may be within the meats that we're eating. We're not going to have, a thumb sized piece of fats just sat on our plate, i.e., a lump of butter, for example, in every meal. So it's quite hard sometimes, I think, to translate those portions into actual plates, which is why I like to kind of segment the plates that the athletes are using. So, on a high kind of performing day or the day before, to load up our carbs, we want around 50% of our plate made up of carbohydrates. And again, visual tools are great, but there's always flaws with them because that half a plate could be piled up to the rafters, or it could just be a really thin layer on the plate. So then that's where I'd introduce kind of two fistfuls of carbohydrates to fill half of your plate would be the ideal kind of amount of carbs that they require.
And I think it's important for anyone listening to understand that just like training, just like anything kind of in the sports science world, we're given practical recommendations, but everything's different. Everything needs to be taken within context. Athletes
Yeah.
differ depending on their sport, depending on their age, depending on their size, all these sorts of things. So just want to take everything with that understanding. But again, one thing that kids may have the question about, or at least I've had the questions about, is what should my caloric or macronutrient breakdown be. So yes, it's great to hear that I need to eat a lot of protein, eat a lot of carbs, or eat enough calories or anything like that. But again, if we're trying to be practical, do you have any? There's obviously equations that
Yeah.
people use based on certain things. Do you use some of those to if you have to figure that out, or do you have any other methods that you use?
Yeah, ultimately, like working out your caloric intake or your energy needs is kind of where I'd always, I think, falter in terms of science and research, as you say, Liam, is so important when it comes to that. We test in a lot of the clubs that I work with the RMR of the players, which is the resting metabolic rate, and then we'll times that up to give us their activity based caloric needs. But again, that's still an estimate because we're not tracking every single calorie burnt across the day. And I think we can often find ourselves looking on social media for the answers, for equations, and then trying to kind of times up what we think we require from an estimated point of view. But actually, we can really simplify this when it comes to youth sport. When we look at our kind of TDEE, our total daily energy expenditure, we know that 70% of our daily energy burn is going to be from our basal metabolic rate. So just existing. So that means that every single day, regardless of what we do, even if we sleep for the full 24 hours and we don't move, our basal metabolic rate will still require 70% of what we usually eat in a day typically. Then on top of that, we can start looking at some of the other numbers. So obviously we've got our NEAT activity, which is our kind of non-planned exercise, which is kind of walking, moving. I'm flailing my arms around talking now. Didn't I haven't planned on so many arm reps as I'm talking now, but ultimately that's going to be additional energy burn. Similar if you're at school, for example, walking up and down the stairs to different classrooms, etc., is going to be kind of unplanned activity. Then you've got your thermic effector food, your TEF, which is essentially when we eat food, we obviously chew it, we digest it, and we metabolize it, which all costs the body energy. And then finally, we've got our eat. And a lot of people see eat on a graph and think, oh, that must be when I eat, I burn energy. That's TF. Eat is effectively our planned exercise. So
Hmm.
sports fixtures, training, maybe going to the gym, etc., are all kind of planned activity. So that makes up 100% of our daily energy expenditure. So one of the big things when you look at those percentages on a graph is you'll see that our eat activity only makes up 5% of our total daily energy burn, which means that if we had a day of recovery versus a day of training, typically speaking, we only need 5% less of our food intake for a day of recovery. So for most athletes, they can eat the same every single day. And what I'd suggest is look out for the signs and symptoms of underfueling. So chronic fatigue, not performing at our best, constantly feeling tired, sluggish, potentially brain fog. And also the most obvious one is hunger. If we listen to our body as a youth athlete and we eat when we're hungry and technically stop or slow down when we're full, we're not going to go too far wrong with our caloric intake of what we require. And I think that's probably a more tried and tested method than plugging a bunch of numbers into a formula, which we can do to kind of cross check and double check our estimates. But actually, as a youth athlete, you know your body better than anybody else. So a good chance is really just to listen to the body and start to understand that our daily intake versus a recovery and a training day, the difference of the amount of food or at least calories that we require will only really buffer between 5 and 10%. Ultimately, we're going to need to eat the same every single day. The only thing that will change within the day that we require is our macronutrients, depending on whether we're performing, recovering, or just maintaining our kind of energy levels.
Yeah. How does hydration fit into the equation with all of this?
Hydration, ultimately, I think it's sometimes the forgotten kind of fourth wall of nutrition. We talk about carbs, fats, proteins, and their importance in performance. And then we actually kind of not necessarily neglect hydration, but it comes as a secondary thought of, oh, well, what about water? And a little bit like we've just done there on the podcast, we've spoke so intently on, energy intake, energy balance, but then we've kind of gone, oh, and adding hydration in there. It is
Yeah.
arguably one of the most important factors for any youth athlete to develop and grow. And from my experience and observing, I don't think youth athletes drink enough water when you look at the numbers. Typically speaking, we need around 250 mils every 15 to 20 minutes of activity. And what that doesn't mean is that your coach is suddenly going to watch this podcast and start blowing a whistle every 15 to 20 minutes to let you going down 250 mils of water. What that means is every chance that the coach says, go and take a sip or go and grab some water or take a minute's rest, that's your responsibility as a youth athlete to go and start drinking more water. So over an hour's period time, when we're looking at performance, we're typically going to have around a liter, well, 750 mils to a liter of water, which I imagine, and I challenge most youth athletes that may watch this, I can guarantee 90% of you won't be doing that just based on my experience working in youth sport. So the ways we can look to do that is firstly plan and prepare. Make sure that we've got the water available at training and make sure that we're focused on taking those sips when we get the opportunity to. I've seen some athletes write on their hands like water or drink lots so that they remember as they're running around, right, I need a drink in every break that I get. The other way that we can look to do it is also making sure that pre and post we have plenty of water going into the body. So around 30 minutes before training, around 250 mils to 600 mils of water, depending on our thirst and our hydration levels. Pre training to ensure we don't go into training dehydrated. And then post training, we want to try and just rehydrate as regularly as we possibly can. The biggest telltale factor of hydration is ultimately our urine color. I
Yeah.
always like to kind of prop up the chart where it shows the different gradients of colors and often joke with some of the youth athletes that that's the Dulex color chart of urine, similar to like paint brands where you go into B&Q and
Yeah.
you see all the different colors on the shelf. Ultimately, that is what you're doing is you're testing it against your own urine sample to ensure you're hydrated. Normally speaking, as long as we've got a healthy athlete that isn't on any medication, the darker the color of urine, the more dehydrated we're going to be. The lighter and paler color we are, the more hydrated we are. The one that often gets missed off is a completely clear or translucent urine sample might mean that we're slightly overhydrated. And that often comes with more frequent visits to the bathroom to go to the toilet. So you can start to understand where we might be overhydrating. But as I said at the start of this kind of segment, I reckon around 90% of athletes do underhydrate or are dehydrated going into training. So having that as a kind of a gauge to be able to find out where hydration is day to day without any science is a really good way to look towards hydrating effectively.
And where does the, solution-based drinks come in, Gatorades or electrolyte drinks or anything like that? Where do those fit into an athlete's profile?
Yeah. So based on, I suppose, the research, which is always what we've got to go off as practitioners, is any exercise under 60 minutes shouldn't require any form of carbohydrate based drink or solution. So sports drinks under 60 minutes shouldn't really be needed. The main focus is that our pre-training or pre-match fueling, if it's under 60 minutes, needs to be on point to ensure that we don't require additional carbohydrates or top ups during our performance. Now, if the weather's a little bit hotter and we're burning a little bit more energy or it's a very intense game, then ultimately we might actually need, some form of sports drinks, but that's more in a case by case example. Anything
Mhm.
over 60 minutes, we might want to look towards what I prefer to call, like you say, like liquid energy. So looking towards kind of Gatorades, Lucasades, those kind of sugary, sporty drinks that are going to help benefit us in our overall performance and keep us going for longer because ultimately during let's say a football match or a soccer match we're going to really struggle to be able to eat food on the go whilst we're playing, so the easy
Yeah.
way to do so is take little and often sips of drinks. Now the other side of it, which often gets confused as sports drinks and electrolyte or hydration based drinks, is kind of the key two differences. A sports drink tends to have a higher consumption of carbohydrates in there, which helps with topping up carbs during exercise after 60 minutes to give us more energy. Electrolytes tend to be used mostly, I'd say, in the wrong term based on the research. A lot of times used during a game, whereas it's a little bit too late to be getting our electrolytes in to support rehydration or at least stopping cramp or fatigue or early fatigue. So the focus for electrolytes ideally is pre-performance. When we look at the research now, we want to have the sodium, potassium, and magnesium and zinc in the body ready for our performance. So when we start to sweat, we know that we've got those minerals already in the body, ready to kind of combat any of the
Hmm.
dehydration or the sweating properties that we have. Again, we can still take little and often sips of electrolyte drinks during, but the main focus should come pre to make sure that we reduce the risk of cramps and early fatigue when it comes to electrolytes. But one of the big things I always think is whenever we say the word sports drinks, we either come up with our own definition of it's either a carbohydrate drink, an electrolyte drink, and then potentially we could have a bit of a discussion around caffeinated beverages, which a lot of people somehow consider, your Red Bulls and your Monsters as sports drinks.
Yeah, definitely. What about post work? Well, actually, before we get into that, do we want to go into now switching back over to a little bit more of the food side of things? What is your conversation with athletes as far as, a game day pre-match, morning pre-match meal, post-match meal, full recovery, and feel like where does nutrition play a role in both fueling before the game and then post-match recovery?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at timelines and building a good, robust nutrition plan, I'm kind of a nutritionist that doesn't enjoy meal plans per se, but I do enjoy
Mhm.
timelines. I think the freedom to roam with nutrition is so important, and it's something that I kind of talk about a lot with athletes. Is I'll never dictate the foods that you consume, but I will dictate the types of foods that you need to
Mm.
consume and the timings. That's the only two things I'll ever have control of. I'll never set out an exact breakfast, lunch, dinner, or snacks that you need. I'll just guide you to the right types of snacks and the right timings to consume them. Same with the meals. So if we're talking about a pre-game kind of performance and what we need to do in terms of fueling up efficiently, the key really is we work backwards. So our last kind of snack that we're going to have before the game is around 30 minutes before. So that'll be kind of a sugary based snack that's going to heighten our energy levels. If we want to stay healthy with that as a youth athlete, we look more towards dried fruits. If we want to be a little bit quote unquote unhealthy, we'd look towards sugary sweets. But ultimately, we're going to burn through those sugars quite quickly when we get into our
Mhm.
performance, especially in football. Then we look to kind of step it back even further. That kind of 60-minute mark would be kind of the opportunity to get our last high carb snack in. So that might just be as simple as a cereal bar or potentially a bagel or something along those lines, a piece of fruit, etc. And then 90 minutes before the match, so again, continuously stepping back, would be our last big snack. So that could be some form of wrap or sandwich, etc., that would give us that kind of last boost of energy ready to go into our performance. And then aside from that kind of 90, 60, 30 rule of minutes building up to a game to make sure we're efficiently fueled up, the only other real recommendation that we see is kind of that 3 to 4 hours before of our last big pre-match meal. Now, if your fixture is in the AM, let's say 11 a.m., that meal's obviously going to fall as a breakfast meal. If it's in the PM, it's most likely going to fall as a lunch or an evening meal. So that can vary from porridge oats with some fruit and honey to maybe a pasta or spaghetti based dish with some form of garlic bread or side of bread roll to increase the high carb content in that meal. So the focus really is on timings when it comes to game day before our competition, because the focus has to be on making sure we digest our foods efficiently, but then also ensure that we've got enough food in the body to give us the energy required for the performance we need. After a game, the only real one that I set a rule on for youth athletes is the quicker we can get some form of carb and protein into the body following performance, the better it is for our recovery. So a lot of people come to me with the myth of the 30-minute protein window myth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when we look at the research in that, there is some element of truth. But actually, it's not that a lot of people assume if I don't consume protein within the first 30 minutes of finishing my performance, I'm never going to recover from that performance again. but actually all it does is delay the effect of our recovery. So we're looking at something called muscle protein synthesis, which is a fancy way of saying rebuilding and regrowing the muscles. And actually, the quicker we get protein in, the quicker we elevate our muscle protein synthesis levels, which allows us to be able to recover efficiently. If we do that within the first 30 minutes, we're then going to get a really nice cycle of muscle protein synthesis in before we go into our next meal, which is then going to ultimately contribute to quicker recovery, meaning that we can perform better later on. If for whatever reason we don't eat for the next 4 hours, protein and carbohydrates, because remember, protein's good for recovery, but we also need the carbs to help with the energy required to recover. If we don't do that for 4 hours, our recovery is likely just going to take 4 hours longer over the other side. So if we're an athlete that's performing day in, day out, the importance is a mix of protein and carbs as quick as we can in a food format, ideally for a youth athlete, so that they can perform at their best the following day if they've got training, or even 48 hours after that. Whereas if we forget to do it, it isn't the end of the world. It isn't something that we're never going to recover from that performance ever again if we don't consume carbs and protein, which, to be fair, I've had a lot of parents come to me over my time and actually question that because that's what they've read online, or read somewhere else, or heard through a coach, or another practitioner, for example.
What about in the instances where maybe they have an evening or even a night game, and they're getting home late, and this could be a young athlete, but also just in general athletes. Um, what would be your recommendation as far as fueling post night games? So say they're not getting home till 10, 11 p.m. or even later, because obviously, like you said, you still want to get that food in, but at the same time, you also want to try and get some sleep as well.
Definitely, and I think that almost falls into that equation of we don't want to eat too close to bed either, because that will have
Exactly.
a damage effect on our sleep. So it's important that we get the nutrients into the body, firstly as quick as we can after the game, but secondly not waiting until we're home. It might be 30 minutes, an hour drive home, until we get home, and then we've got to prepare the food, which might take another 30 minutes, and that's just adding to that delayed effect of firstly eating following a fixture, and secondly, struggling towards actually eating to digest before bed. The recommendations vary from 30 minutes before bed to an hour and 30 minutes before bed for digestion to ensure that it doesn't affect our sleep. And the research is quite varied around that. My big advice for those that are potentially performing late into the evening is to take some form of high carb and high protein snack with you that you can have as soon as you finish in the changing room following a fixture. And when I say that, I don't mean go and buy the next supplement that's carb and protein mix, which there's plenty of them out there. Because as youth athletes, we're not just looking for the quick fix supplement and the convenience like most adult athletes are. We're looking for the nutrients that are contained within the foods that we're having as well. So something as simple as like a yogurt, a Greek style yogurt with some granola and fruit as kind of like a large portion and serving can massively hit your protein and your carb intake whilst also getting nutrients into the body. And again, quite portable in terms of putting it in a Tupperware, in a chill, cool box to take to a fixture with you. So then as soon as we finish and we're in the changing rooms getting changed, we're eating that and nibbling away on it, ready to then, be able to digest it in time to go to bed. So it doesn't always have to be like a large meal
Meal.
afterwards,
Yeah.
especially because most of our intake will have come from building up to this performance. If it's a 7, 8 o'clock kickoff, we might be looking at breakfast, plenty of snacks, lunch, plenty of snacks, our evening meal, which will be our pre-match meal, plenty more snacks, that kind of 90, 60, 30 rule, our performance. And then it might just be that we need a little top up of energy before we go to bed. But the most important part of that is then the breakfast that follows. Let the body recover, let the
Yeah.
body sleep. Then we need to make sure that we're back on that fueling strategy for the breakfast. Really, we need to make sure we're getting plenty of protein and plenty of carbs in our recovery based breakfast alongside a good hit of fruit and veg as well.
Yeah, and I think just that whole piece right from the beginning is important to realize. A big part of it that, like you mentioned, was that you give them guidelines and recommendations, but you're not telling them exactly what to eat. And you'll have athletes, I'm sure, come up to you because they come up to me as well, and ask, what should I eat before the game? What should I eat after the game? What should I do? And I think nutrition can be so individualized in that sense, and as you're a growing athlete, you learn, what made my stomach feel good before that game. What did I eat that time that didn't make me feel so good? You kind of, as you go along through your career, you'll learn the things that as long as you're eating, like you said, the right type of macronutrients and more so the timing, then you can be a little bit flat. It doesn't matter if you have pasta or a sandwich or this or that. Having that individuality is pretty important.
Yeah, one of the big things for me as well is not trying out anything new on a game
Yeah.
day. So a lot of the times I get athletes that come to me with a new pre-match meal that they want to try, or I
Hmm.
saw X do this on Instagram. Name insert famous footballer, rugby player, whatever sport it might be. I'm going to try that on my next game day, and I think the big thing is yes, I'm not going to tell you that you can't do that, but you need to try it out in training first, where ultimately it doesn't matter as much. If you get stomachache from having a certain type of meal, or
Hmm.
maybe it takes you longer to digest a certain type of pasta or bread or wraps, for example, learn that in training so that we don't take it into a match. One of the worst things I see athletes do is they suddenly decide they're going to switch up their pre-game fueling routine, but they've never actually tried that fueling routine in training. And I think, it's similar to how we'd never go into a match and suddenly decide to try a new skill for the first time ever. We shouldn't do the
Hmm.
same with nutrition. We test it and we try it in training, and then once we've kind of established that it works for us, we can take it into the match day protocol. Then,
Yeah, exactly. Where do you kind of touched on it there as well? Where do supplements fit in for you? And more so specific to youth athletes in this context.
yeah, I think supplements over the last few years have firstly blown up in terms of the
Yeah.
marketing around them, the branding, and arguably, youth athletes don't need them. That's probably the bold kind of blanket statement, but I'll break that down a little bit more because there is an element where we may look towards supplementation, certainly in the older youth athletes that I work with, and certainly in those that maybe have deficiencies are the two real key markers.
Mhm.
There's a really good research paper by Graham Close, I believe, came out maybe last year or like late last year or the year before, called "Food First but Not Food Only." So when I was at university learning about nutrition, it was always about the food first approach. Any nutritionist's tagline, what's your philosophy was, "I'm a food first nutritionist. I'm always focusing on nutrition." And then Graham Close, who's been around in the industry for years as a performance nutritionist, a researcher and a professor, came up with this kind of idea of that yes, food first for the majority of athletes, but there is an exception to the rule. We can't just always just blanket approach food first, food first.
Mhm.
So, for example, vitamin D is a really great example of food first, but not food only. When we look at prevalence data, and granted it's nice and sunny where I am right now, and we're in the middle of summer in the UK, we probably don't need a vitamin D supplement because we're getting our 15 minutes of direct sunlight a day. But once we start getting into those winter months and those darker days, the likelihood is that our vitamin D levels are going to suffer for that. What does that mean for a youth athlete? Potentially more bone-based injuries, potentially more illnesses, coughs, colds, flus, etc., and a weakened immune system. So for a youth athlete that's looking to optimize their strategy when it comes to nutrition, vitamin D might potentially be an answer for that. Now, often what I get combated with parents is, but you said food first. We're talking about sunlight here. Can I not just up the amount of vitamin D foods that I'm giving to my youth athlete? So maybe oranges, eggs, mushrooms, etc., fortified cereals and milks that have vitamin D added. Absolutely, we can, but we know from the research that our body can only really absorb around 20% of our daily intake of vitamin D required through our foods. So it becomes quite complicated and complex when we try to get it through food only. So that's why we need to start looking at maybe supplements on that end. On the flip side, that's kind of encompassing all youth athletes. The top end, the kind of the 18 pluses, those that are kind of breaking into first teams, there might be a case to start utilizing caffeine based supplementation and also creatine.
Yeah.
The big fact that I think always shocks parents is with creatine is it doesn't cause hair loss, though there is some mums blogs articles out there that says that, and it also doesn't cause kind of liver or kidney damage. It's not a steroid; it's a completely natural compound. And what I always explain is if we wanted to get our creatine dose required for the performance markers that we look to get, so increasing explosive power, muscle size, and strength, we'd need around, I believe it's 2.5 kilograms of salmon per day to get 5 grams of creatine, which is what's in an individual scoop. Now, the hair loss and the kidney and the liver problems that come from the creatine studies are all very one off basis. I know the hair loss one was more of a longitudinal study, and one of the observations they found was hair loss. But when you look at male pattern baldness, their
Yeah.
age group and demographic massively fit that already. And similar to the liver and kidney one, there was already underlying issues with, I believe, the kidney of this individual, which caused then obviously, exasperation of having creatine. But it's a natural food substance similar to protein. So for those older athletes in an environment of professional sport, there is an element where we'd look to increase kind of creatine consumption once muscles are kind of getting to that fully developed phase, and we're looking to build more size and strength and stretching that kind of performance barrier that little bit further. And that kind of falls for caffeine as well. I talk a lot to kind of your under 14s, 15s athletes, and they always ask, well, why not caffeine now? Why do you want me to avoid the energy drinks and the coffees and the caffeine gums and gels? And it's not necessarily that they're going to cause harm to a potential if they're consumed in the right dose. It's more that the tolerance of the body doesn't always give you you lose your caffeine tolerance. I can have a coffee in the morning every morning or even two, and I won't feel the effects of the caffeine. So the ideal scenario is, because I'm 27 years of age and I've been drinking coffee since I was probably 16. So like the argument is to get that kind of real feel of caffeine and that additional rush of energy. It's important to kind of delay the use of caffeine in your career. Obviously, there comes a point where when you're performing week in, week out for a professional club, it's going to be beneficial, but also our caffeine tolerance changes as we get older. So those kind of two supplements are ones that I'd stick in more towards the older academy athletes. But then youth athletes, vitamin D is one of those supplements that I widely like to use with kind of all ages of the academy.
What about where does protein fit in?
Good one. For the one we've missed, the biggest, probably researched, apart from caffeine and
I know people will want to know that one.
yeah, I mean, caffeine, creatine, and protein are your big three. Really, they the most researched and safe supplements that are out on the market. Ultimately, for those that maybe don't know, protein powder, or at least whey protein powder, was a byproduct of making cheese. So when they used to make cheese, curd and whey used to come off the cheese, and it used to be considered a disposable waste product. And then I think somebody once tested it, found that it actually had a really high protein content, and then started using whey that came off the cheeses as a product of increasing protein in general population. Soon spread to athletes, soon became powderized, soon became marketable, and that's why we end up with these bags of powdered whey protein. Now, there's no dangers in having whey protein, and there's no real side effects that are going to be negative, aside from what a youth athlete is going to be missing out on. We talk about nutrient dense foods. Ideally, a protein shake or a protein powder is built and designed to tick a box, to
Yeah.
effectively pick that protein intake marker off the list. So a lot of like larger rugby players will use it. So we spoke earlier about that kind of 2.2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram. If you're a 100 kilogram athlete, male, rugby player that's 100 kg, you're looking potentially at needing 250 grams of protein a day. If anybody's got the time, pause this and go and Google how many chicken breasts you probably need to do that. But I imagine it'd be quite a lot just off the knowledge of how much is in a single chicken breast. So an easy, convenient way of just topping up those sources is to have a shake. Now, for a youth athlete, it's much more beneficial to have a chicken breast or a yogurt that's going to have healthy fats in, more nutrients, and a lot more vitamins and minerals that's going to benefit the growth and development of the body. So, as much as I know a lot of youth athletes come to me and say, my parents have told me I can't have a protein shake until I'm 16, but the parents don't often always understand the reason behind why they don't need the protein shake, other than it's a supplement. Kids shouldn't have supplements, which is
Yeah.
absolutely correct. But we need to also make sure that we've got the education piece of it, which is actually, if we compare the two, a brand of protein powder versus a chicken breast or a yogurt, the nutrient density in those foods are going to be much higher than just the protein shake. Don't get me wrong, once we get to adult life and we get to being a sports star, and maybe we're rushing out of a changing room to go and do an interview, as we're in demand or in the media, then taking a protein shake along the walk on the corridor is not a bad idea. Or like I mentioned earlier, the example of a larger rugby player having to hit a certain goal of protein. So they're kind of where I'd sit with protein for youth athletes when it comes to supplementation.
Perfect. Do you have any kind of, obviously this is all well and good. Nutrition is super important, but at the same time, when we work with youth athletes, we also will be, semi-realistic, and even if they are generally good with nutrition, there's going to be a bit of a balance. Do you have any rule, like an 80-20 rule or anything like that that you touch on?
Yeah, absolutely. 80-20 rule is what I live by with all athletes, not just youth athletes, with adult athletes. You might want to be the best, and you think to be the best, you have to be 100% on it all of the time. I always say to athletes, like, we have an off season for a reason. The body has to recover. Like, we can't just go for, however long an athlete's career is, 10, 20 years non-stop, because we will break down. And that happens with our nutrition as well. If we find ourselves trying to eat 100% healthy all of the time, we're likely going to have a binge. And that might not happen. We might be 100% healthy Monday to Friday, and we might end up falling, and
Hmm.
craving some form of foods in the masses. So, for example, I've seen a lot of athletes try it. They'll do 3 weeks of clean eating in their eyes, and they'll have 100% healthy foods, no junk, no rubbish, no nothing that would cause any imbalances to nutrition. And then they get to that fourth week, and it's almost like all hell breaks loose. It's kind of like pizzas on Monday, takeaways on Tuesday,
Yeah.
a full bar of chocolate for breakfast on Wednesday, and it's all because of this kind of pent up emotion around
Yeah.
these foods. And then once we break it, it's almost like, well, who cares? I'll start again next week. So the only way really to combat that, and Liam, you touched on it really well there, was the 80-20 rule. And for me, that is the principle to any good nutritional program. Is 80% of the time we eat all of the best foods, some of the stuff we've spoke about earlier, all the best foods that are going to benefit our performance and our overall recovery when it comes to being an athlete. And then I think second of all, we look towards then the 20%. And some people coin this as the unhealthy foods. I prefer to put it as the fun foods, because they're not unhealthy if we only have them 20% of the time. So we need to remove that stigma of healthy and unhealthy, and be healthy and fun foods is kind of where I like to place it, as a bit of a mantra for that. And the big part of that is picking what your 20% foods are. And again, we spoke about leading an athlete to the types of foods they should have for performance in terms of the amount and type. I do the same for the fun foods as well. I'll never kind of say you can't have this specific brand of chocolate or this specific pack of crisps. It's completely up to the athlete what their 20% rule is. I always say in all of my nutrition talks, my 20% has got to be chocolate covered digestive biscuits dunked in a cup of tea, because I couldn't live without them. And
Yeah.
a couple of them a day keep me happy and keep me going in my job. But as an athlete, that might be something like a meal, on a post game Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening treat of having a McDonald's or having a Burger King. It doesn't have to be a small thing every day. It can be kind of spread across the week. And I think the only important rule that goes with the 80-20 rule is making sure that on a day of performance, so for example, a match day, we're not consuming anything that's too high in fats, because that's going to ruin our digestion of our carbohydrates and stop us performing at our best, and potentially letting it sit on the stomach. And also that first meal after performance. So we spoke about having maybe yogurt and granola in the dressing room. Often I'll see pizzas in the changing room, ordered from large pizza chains that aren't always the best in terms of your carbs and your protein. So it's important that your post-match meal and your pre-match meal are considered your 80% rule, and then your 20% can fall anywhere else within the week for that. So that's the only real importance and addition to that rule that I think is often missed.
Yeah, I remember being a college athlete and leaving away games, and you just hop right on the bus. Coach orders 20 pizzas, and and that's all you're eating on the way home. And I remember even then, the first time you're like, oh, this is great, and then after that, it's like, ah, I would love an actual meal right now.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Last question I have for you is just a quick: do you have any, farewell advice for a parent or a youth athlete listening to this that wants to get better with their nutrition?
Absolutely. I think obviously listen back to what we spoke about, make some notes on some of the key topics that we've put together for this session. But I think ultimately it all comes back down to listening to your body. I think, when we're looking at recovery and performance, a youth athlete and a parent as well is probably going to know a lot about their child. If we notice signs of fatigue or potential, repetitive illness, for example, there is probably something going on with the nutrition that needs a little bit more exploration with. So it might be, as we mentioned, and me and Liam spoke about earlier, that energy balance side of things, of making sure we're getting the right intake for the expenditure we're doing every day. Or potentially, if it's consistently sore muscles, it might be a lack of vitamins and minerals or protein, for example, and not hitting those markers that we require. So I think it's more about listening to your body, and that's probably my take home message. And of course, what we've just touched upon, stick to that 80-20 rule and never try to be that athlete that hits it 100% of the time, because I can guarantee you at some point you will crumble and it won't be the nicest fall from grace, should we say. So make sure that you keep those fun foods in there and also still enjoy your food and nutrition, although you are an athlete trying to perform at a high level.
And where can people find you if they wanted to reach out?
I think best place to find me is probably Instagram. I'm probably the most active on there. I try and put some good advice and tips out across different Instagram reels on that platform, and that's just at DRN Nutrition. And you can find loads of different stuff on there. If you want to reach out and drop me a message because you've listened to the podcast and have a question, more than happy to pick up any questions that you might have as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing this, Dan. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.